The party is traveling through the jungles of Chult. Marty the monk holds up a hand to have everybody stop, and he strains, leaning forward, listening. Suddenly, his eyes grow wide. He turns back to the party and he says, "Undead!" Connie the cleric pulls her shield up, the symbol of Lathander emblazoned on it. She says, "Step back, Marty. I've got this." She reaches into her pocket, pulls out a handful of yellow powder, and she begins to say the words of power, calling upon her deity. And she sifts the powder, lets it fall from her hands. And as the zombies and the skeletons break out of the jungle, rushing towards the party, she calls down a great column of fire and divine energy that smites the undead from in front of the party. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you use the Flame Strike spell. Hey everybody, welcome to Divine Thursday for September 3rd, 2020. I'm your host, DM Gallibond. Let's get this show on the road. Alright, so Flame Strike is a 5th level spell that is for clerics and paladins and some warlocks, depending on their patron, and some sorcerers, depending on what their power source is that they have. 5th level. 5th level spell, 1 action to cast it, range out to 60 feet, and a 10-foot radius, 40-foot high cylinder. And the material component is that pinch of sulfur. So that handful of the yellow powder that our cleric was using in the open. The damage type is both fire and radiant. And when you upcast this spell, you add 1d6 damage, and you choose either 1d6 of fire or 1d6 of radiant. Because normally the damage is a total of 8d6, but it's 2 pools of 4d6. You have to roll 1 pool of 4d6 for the fire, 1 pool of 4d6 for the radiant. Now, why would they do it that way? Well, there's lots of creatures out there that have resistance to fire or vulnerability to fire. And then there are some creatures out there that have resistance to radiant or they have vulnerability to radiant. Because it has some damage is classified as one type, some damage is classified as the other. There's very few creatures out there that are going to have either resistance or immunity to both fire and radiant. So you're always going to do some damage, almost always going to do some damage to the creature with this spell. And if it has vulnerability to either of these damage types, then you could do a lot. Like vampires, they have vulnerability to radiant damage. Mummies, for instance, have vulnerability to fire damage. So you use this spell on a mummy, you'll get the regular radiant damage and double the fire damage. Use it on a vampire, you get the regular fire and double the radiant damage. Alright, so that's the way this works. Now, this spell goes all the way back to AD&D days, and it's kind of interesting. The area of effect was 10 feet in diameter. 5th edition, it's a 10-foot radius, so 20 feet in diameter. This is a little bit narrower, and it's a 30-foot high column as opposed to a 40-foot high column. And it's all fire damage, and it's 68 fire. So now you notice how that's reversed a little bit. It's 8d6 total damage in 8d6 total damage in 5th edition. It's 6d8 total damage in 1st edition, and all of that damage is fire. So they had not invented radiant radiant damage yet. In fact, radiant damage didn't start to creep into the game until 3rd edition, but they really didn't have a name for it as radiant damage until 4th edition D&D. All right, and then a pinch of sulfur is the material component. All right, 2nd edition, same thing as 1st edition, except they say it's a 5-foot radius instead of a 10-foot diameter. That's the only difference. And saving throw is half. Oh, yes, there is one interesting thing in 1st edition. Let me go back here. If the target fails the save, then you roll 6d8 damage. But if they make their save, you roll 3d8 damage. Now that's interesting because starting in 2nd edition, whenever they had something like that, they just say you roll the 6d8 and you just take half if they save. But in AD&D, it was actually 2 different dice rolls. If they fail the save, it's 1 set of dice that you roll. If you make the save, it's a different set of dice that you roll. All right. Now, 3rd edition. We have for clerics, druids, the sun domain, and warlocks. And it's a 10-foot radius, 40-foot high. So this is where we now get the height to 40 feet, and the width is to 20 feet, just like it is in 5th edition. And you'll notice the spell deals 1d6 points of damage per caster level, maximum 15d6. Now, half the damage is fire, but the other half results directly from divine power and is therefore not subject to being reduced to resistance of fire-based attacks, such as that granted by protection from energy fire, fire shield, chill shield, and similar magic. So this whole long thing, the other half results directly from divine power. That's a fancy way of saying radiant damage because they didn't have a term for radiant damage yet. But when radiant damage was released in 4th edition and it did get a name, it's classified as the damage that comes from either the power of the celestial beings like the deities or the power of the stars themselves. So it's kind of like in scientific earth terms, it's kind of like radiation damage is basically what it is. And then in 4th edition, it is a daily power for 9th level clerics. And it's kind of interesting how this differs, because it seems like a lot less damage, but potentially it could deal just as much, if not more damage over time. Area burst 2 within 10 squares or within 50 feet of the caster. Every enemy in burst, so it only affects enemies. It doesn't affect creatures like the previous editions do. And it's 2d10 plus wisdom modifier fire damage initially. And then it's ongoing 5 plus wisdom modifier fire damage save ends. So you think, okay, compared to the other editions, 2d10, that's not a whole lot of damage. But if you think of that 5 or better, 5 plus wisdom damage every round, if your enemies are having a hard time making their saving throws, then that every 5 that 5 points every round just ticks and ticks and ticks and ticks and ticks, and can really add up after a while. And in 4th edition, unless there was some sort of, and I think 5th edition is the same way, unless there was some sort of feature that specifically says so, all of your saving throws are made at the end of the round. So you would take the ongoing damage at the beginning of the round, and then the enemy at the end of the round would have to try to save. And if they didn't, then when their turn came around again, they would immediately take that next tick of damage. All right. That is going to do it for our discussion of Flame Strike. And yes, 5th edition, unlike 4th edition, is similar to 1st and 2nd and 3rd in that in 5th edition, it's all creatures. So, unless your allies have something that makes them immune to both fire and radiant damage, you don't want to put this in the middle of combat because you're going to hit all the creatures and they're all going to have to make a save and take damage if they take the full damage if they fail their save, or take half damage if they make it. All right, well, that is going to do it for Divine Thursday. If you like the new format of the video, if you like what we're doing here on the channel, please subscribe. Please like the video. Please share the video. Please click the post notification bell so that every time a new video drops on the channel, you will be notified about it. All right, that is going to do it for me. Hope that you have enjoyed this edition of Divine Thursday. Good night, everybody.